This is part 3 of T6 Basic Formation. In this lesson we talk about the following formation maneuvers. Refer to parts 1 and 2 for the breakout, practice last wingman, and wing work. The primary source for formation ground operations is the 11248 and Squadron Operating Procedures and Standards. Formations normally taxi together as a two-ship. During taxi at home station only, number 1 should stagger on the downwind side. Number 1 can use the windsock to assist determining which side of the taxiway line to put number 2. Give 2 the fat side of the windsock. There are 3 options for getting a T6 formation airborne. Option 1, the wing takeoff, is the most common. Option 2, an interval takeoff, is generally driven by wind requirements. Option 3, an instrument trail departure, is used when the ceiling and/or visibility does not allow an interval or wing takeoff. For a wing takeoff, number 1 will place 2 on the upwind side for takeoff when the crosswind component exceeds 5 knots to keep 2 from entering 1's wake turbulence in the event number 2 falls behind. If crosswinds are not a factor, number 1 should consider placing 2 on the outside of the first turn if entering IMC. If crosswinds and IMC are not factors, number 1 should consider placing 2 on the inside of the first turn. Number 1 takes the center of one half of the runway and taxis a sufficient distance past the threshold to allow 2 room to maneuver into position. Number 2 lines up on the fingertip line with a minimum of 20 feet of lateral wingtip clearance. Number 2 gives a head nod to signify ready for run-up. 1 gives a run-up signal and looks at number 2. 2 acknowledges the signal with a head nod. Both aircraft smoothly increase the PCL to approximately 30% torque and check their engine. During the engine run-up, continue to primarily focus attention outside the aircraft with only short glances inside the cockpit. Ensure the aircraft does not creep forward. When ready for takeoff, number 2 gives a head nod to 1. Number 1 signals for brake release with 3 taps on the side of their helmet, followed by an upward and then a downward head nod. The mantra, "On my command brakes release," is a common memory aid to help number 1 signal for the brake release. Both aircraft then smoothly add power, with number 1 targeting 85 to 95% torque to give number 2 a slight power advantage. 2 uses power as required to maintain position on the takeoff roll. Number 2 uses peripheral vision to detect lateral movement on the runway and matches number 1's pitch attitude. Stack level, helmet on the horizon, until the gear and flaps are raised. When the formation is safely airborne with a minimum of 110 knots indicated, number 1 retracts both gear and flaps. Number 2 raises gear and flaps when climbing, and 1's gear begins to retract. Number 2 never raises the gear before 1. An interval takeoff is used most often when crosswinds exceed 15 knots. The interval takeoff may be accomplished from a static lineup or a rolling takeoff. A static interval takeoff begins the same as a wing takeoff. Number 2 gives a head nod when ready for run-up, 1 gives the run-up signal, and 2 head nods when their run-up check is complete. When ready for takeoff, 1 will release their brakes and perform a max power takeoff. Wingmen will ensure a minimum of 6-second spacing following lead, then perform a max power takeoff. Each aircraft should steer toward, but not cross, the center of the runway after the start of their takeoff roll. When airborne at a minimum of 160 knots indicated, number 1 reduces power to 85 to 95%, or as required for an intermediate level off, and maintains airspeed of 160 knots. The rejoin may be a turning rejoin, a straight-ahead rejoin, or in some cases, a combination of both. Number 2 must be alert for transitions from one type of rejoin to another, as number 1 follows the departure route. Unless briefed otherwise, number 2 will rejoin to the inside of the first turn. The most common error 2 may make is delaying their power push to max. Remember, the weather could be as low as 1503 during an interval takeoff. Too much spacing from 1 will delay the rejoin into fingertip, which would delay 1's climb into the weather. The 20-second instrument trail takeoff is used when weather does not permit a wing or 6-second interval takeoff. It is executed similar to the 6-second takeoff with one notable difference. While in the climb, each aircraft will announce over interplane frequency their altitude when passing even 1,000 feet and when initiating heading changes. When number 1 transmits a heading change, 2 waits 20 seconds to initiate their turn. Number 2 will stay 1,000 feet below 1 until visual has been acquired and permission is given by 1 for number 2 to join to close formation. Route is a wider extension of close formation spacing and is flown to enhance clearing and visual lookout, increase flight maneuverability, and ease the completion of in-flight checks, radio changes, other cockpit tasks, or simply to allow number 2 to relax. Number 1 sends 2 to route with a radio call or visual signal. With the formation en route, number 1 should restrict maneuvering to moderate turns and pitch changes. Maximum bank angle en route is approximately 60 degrees. Route spacing is from 2 ship widths to no further than approximately 500 feet. Route is flown no further forward than line abreast and no further aft than the extended 30-degree fingertip line. When not in a turn, number 2 generally maintains a position stack level with 1 by keeping the helmet of number 1's front cockpit pilot on the horizon. Although the formal definition of the route position has fairly wide tolerances, number 2 should strive to maintain a specific position when en route. 2 should exercise judgment when selecting a route position. If weather is a factor or a reform to fingertip is anticipated, select a position towards 2 ship widths and 30 degrees aft. If weather is not a factor and a long cruise is anticipated, select a position toward 500 feet and line abreast to aid in clearing and performing cockpit duties. When inside a turn, number 2 maneuvers below 1's plane of motion only as necessary to keep number 1 in sight just above the canopy rail. On the outside of the turn, number 2 maintains the same vertical references used in echelon turns. As in fingertip, number 2 will not cross to the opposite side unless specifically directed to do so verbally or given a cross-under signal from number 1. Number 2 stabilizes en route before diverting attention to change radio channels, accomplish in-flight checks, or execute other cockpit tasks. The primary objective of the pitch-out is to provide spacing for rejoin practice. The pitch-out is normally a level turn, approximately 180 degrees. Number 1 directs a pitch out with a visual signal or radio call. Clear in the direction of the desired turn and begin a turn away from number 2 using approximately 60 degrees of bank and sufficient G to establish the desired airspeed. If a rejoin is planned immediately after rolling out, number 1 should maintain 180 knots indicated during the turn and rollout. Allow enough time for number 2 to complete the pitch out and then direct the rejoin with a radio call or visual signal. Number 2 must maintain visual and delay their turn 2 to 3 seconds, which should provide approximately 500 to 1,000 feet of separation at rollout, then turn to follow number 1. Delaying 5 to 7 seconds will result in approximately 1,500 to 2,000 foot spacing. Roll out behind and slightly below number 1. Place number 1 approximately 1 to 2 ship widths above the horizon. Rejoin when directed. Number 1 initiates a rejoin with a radio call or visual signal and may use slight climbs or descents during a rejoin when necessary for energy management or area orientation. All rejoins are to fingertip unless directed otherwise by number 1. Unless otherwise briefed, rejoin airspeed in the T6 is 180 knots indicated. Number 1 calls out current airspeed if it differs more than 10 knots from briefed or expected rejoin airspeed. The size of number 1's wing rock is based on distance between the aircraft. Number 2 will rejoin to 1's left wing unless directed otherwise. Increase airspeed to generate closure. Initially use 20 to 30 knots of overtake. Establish a position behind and slightly below number 1 with a vector towards 1's low 6 o'clock position. Placing number 1 slightly above the horizon will help maintain separation from number 1's wake turbulence. Continue to close until approximately 500 feet, which is about where the pitot tubes can be seen. At this point, bank slightly away from 1 toward a position 2 to 4 ship widths out from number 1's wingtip. Decrease overtake with a power reduction and plan to arrive in the route position with the same airspeed as number 1. After stabilized en route, move into fingertip. If number 1 turns during a straight-ahead rejoin, transition to a turning rejoin and be alert for possible overshoot situations. To direct a turning rejoin, number 1 should use a large wing rock with the first wing dip in the direction of the rejoin. Maintain 30 degrees of bank and 180 knots unless otherwise briefed. Bank and pitch may be varied if required for area orientation. A slight climb or descent is also acceptable for energy management. When number 1 starts to turn, 2 will begin a turn in the same direction to intercept the desired aspect. 2 simultaneously establishes desired vertical separation, also known as stack, by placing number 1 within approximately 2 ship widths of the horizon. If range is initially closer than about 500 feet, execute a high or low yo-yo. The yo-yo maneuver creates turning room by using vertical, out-of-plane motion. A high yo-yo is a reposition of number 2's aircraft that uses various combinations of pursuit and a move out of plane above number 1's plane of motion to control closure and aspect to prevent a potential 3-9 line overshoot. Likewise, number 2 can low yo-yo to move out of plane below number 1's plane of motion to increase closure and aspect angle. Creating a large heading crossing angle will result in a rapid increase in range from number 1. A high yo-yo is beneficial to preserve energy, so number 2 can trade altitude for airspeed once ready to maneuver from the outside of the turn to the inside. The low yo-yo is best used if number 1 is flying just below the base of clouds. Once on the inside of the turn, at 500 feet or more of spacing, number 2 will begin the rejoin with approximately 20 to 30 knots of closure. Manage aspect with minor adjustments to bank angle. The visual reference for line is number 1's star or SA between the front of the rudder and aft portion of the canopy. This area between the rudder and the canopy is informally called the saddle. If the range is such that the star or SA is not visual, line can also be maintained by placing number 1's top of the rudder in line with their wingtip. When stable in the proper aspect angle, there is no line of sight. Again, use varying degrees of bank angle to manage aspect during a rejoin. Shallow the bank angle to decrease aspect, and increase the bank angle to increase aspect. The critical stage of the rejoin begins approximately 500 feet from number 1. Inside 3 to 500 feet, the normal close fingertip references will become visible. Descend slightly and move forward onto an extension of the fingertip reference line. Begin decreasing closure with a power reduction and speed brake as necessary. Monitor bank and overtake closely during the last few hundred feet to ensure aspect and closure are under control. Plan to stabilize en route with slight positive closure but approximately co-airspeed with number 1, and then move into fingertip at a controlled rate. A properly flown overshoot will safely dissipate excessive closure or aspect during a rejoin. Number 2 must not delay an overshoot with an unusually aggressive attempt to save a rejoin. During an overshoot, keep number 1 in sight at all times. Reduce power and use speed brake if required as soon as excessive overtake is recognized. For a straight ahead rejoin overshoot, maintain lateral spacing on a parallel or divergent vector from number 1. A small, controllable 3-9 line overshoot is easily managed and can still allow an effective rejoin. There is no need to break out if flight paths are not convergent and visual contact can be maintained. If a breakout is required, if safety permits, use a shallow to medium bank away from number 1 to maintain visual. To overshoot during a turning rejoin, attempt to overshoot early enough to cross number 1's 6 o'clock with a minimum spacing of 2 ship lengths. Reduce power and use speed brake as required. Once outside the turn, use bank and backstick pressure as necessary to stabilize in route echelon position. Fly no higher than route echelon. When stabilized with forward line of sight, complete a crossunder to the fingertip position on the inside of the turn. Perform a G awareness exercise before accomplishing any maneuver that may require 3 or more Gs. The GX procedure itself is covered in Chapter 6 of the 11248. Follow local unit procedures and comm standards for the formation GX. When each aircraft is at the proper airspeed, number 1 will give the pitch-out signal. Upon rolling out, number 1 will normally direct an ops check and rejoin. The objective of the echelon turn is to turn the formation while in close or route formation using other than fingertip references. All turns while in route position will be echelon turns. When in fingertip, however, turns are only flown as echelon turns in the visual traffic pattern or if indicated by number 1. Leading an echelon turn, number 1 should roll smoothly into bank, generally 60 degrees, and maintain appropriate backstick pressure. Slight variations in bank angle to controlled undesired climbs or descents are smoother and easier for number 2 than variations in backstick pressure. Number 1's roll rate should approximate that used during instrument conditions. 2 matches number 1's roll rate and uses backstick pressure to maintain spacing. In a level turn, the horizon bisects number 1's fuselage. In the front cockpit, approximately 1/2 of the yellow rescue door should be visible behind the aft edge of number 1's wing, and 1 wingspan spacing will exist between the aircraft. If out of position, use bank to correct vertical stack, power to correct forward and aft position, and backstick pressure to maintain spacing. During rollout, number 1 should use a smooth roll rate and gradually reduce back pressure. Number 2 matches 1's roll rate to maintain position. Upon rolling back to wings level, 2 should be re-established in the fingertip position. Close trail simulates aerial refueling. Actual AR is typically limited to 30 degrees of bank. In the T6, however, it is generally flown using wingwork 3 parameters. Number 2 maintains a position below and behind number 1. As a vertical reference, the engine exhaust stacks should be visible directly on top of the wing. Close trail spacing is 1 to 2 ship lengths behind number 1, just below 1's wake turbulence and prop wash. Number 1 can send 2 to close trail with a visual signal or a radio call. 2 will make a radio call once stable in the close trail position. The front cockpit visual reference for 1 ship length spacing is number 1's wingtips between the AOA indexer and magnetic compass. Number 1 may direct 2 to fingertip with a shallow wing rock or radio call. Unless directed otherwise, number 2 goes to fingertip on the left side if number 1 is wings level attitude or to fingertip on the inside of the turn. Number 1 may also direct number 2 to root or fighting wing with a radio call. A crossunder is used to reposition number 2 from one side of the formation to the other. It may be accomplished with the formation in fingertip or root formation. Number 2 maintains nose-tail separation while crossing under. 1 directs a crossunder with a radio call or a visual signal. The visual signal is a rapid, shallow wing dip in the desired direction of the crossunder. The size of the wing dip should be proportional to number 2's spacing. To accomplish a crossunder, reduced power is required to establish a small forward line of sight rate. Move back and down below number 1's plane of motion to establish nose-tail clearance, and then add power slightly to stop rearward movement. Bank slightly toward the new side to change aircraft heading a few degrees, which creates a small heading crossing angle. Roll wings level and fly across and behind number 1. Typically, while passing 1's 6 o'clock position, a power increase is required to maintain proper nose-tail separation. Re-establish number 1's heading when in the desired position on the new side. Once stable on the new side, add power to move forward and up into fingertip position. The fighting wing position enhances formation flexibility or maximizes clearing. It is a fluid position defined by a 30 to 45 degree cone, 500 to 1,000 feet aft of number 1. Number 1 directs the wingman to fighting wing with a radio call. 2 acknowledges and maneuvers into the cone with a combination of pursuit selection and lift vector placement. An initial turn away from number 1 increases lateral spacing and causes a slight movement aft of number 1. The rate of aft movement can be increased with use of power, speed brake, or a vertical movement out of plane. Flying and fighting wing requires constant analysis of aspect angle and closure to apply the proper amounts of lead and leg pursuit to stay within the cone. Number 2 should not stagnate in number 1's high or low 6 o'clock while maneuvering within the cone, because it is difficult for number 1 to monitor number 2 in this position. To reform from fighting wing, number 1 signals a reform or directs number 2 to another formation position. If number 1 desires 2 to reform to a particular side, the reform is directed with a radio call or a wing rock. Lacking direction from number 1, 2 reforms to the side currently occupied. The objective of extended trail is to remain in the fighting wing cone with a constant power setting using lead, leg, and pure pursuit in the horizontal and vertical axes. ET is divided into 3 distinct levels to practice 3-dimensional maneuvering in relation to another aircraft. In ET, number 1 provides a stable platform for 2 to maneuver with using consistent, predictable roll rates and no sudden changes in backstick pressure. The process of analyzing and solving angular, range, closure, and line of sight problems requires an understanding of the consequences of flying each pursuit option and lift vector placement. ET maneuvering is limited to no closer than 500 foot slant range. Momentary deviations within 500 feet are acceptable if they are quickly recognized and remedied. If unable to quickly regain the fighting wing cone, call terminate. In ET, minimum range between the aircraft is 300 feet. If number 2 accidentally ends up inside this 300 foot bubble, a knock-it-off must be called. Abrupt turn reversals by number 1 are prohibited. Abrupt turn reversals are turns in one direction followed by a rapid, unanticipated roll in the opposite direction. ET is flown to ship only. Do not maneuver over the top in level 3 if number 1 is blind or number 2 is not in position to go over the top. Instead, number 1 transitions to level 2 maneuvering until both of these requirements are satisfied prior to initiating an over-the-top maneuver. Minimum airspeed for extended trail is 100 knots. If below 100 knots, a knock-it-off must be called. ET is directed over the radio by 1. 2 acknowledges as directed by current squadron standards, maneuvers to route, and both aircraft perform a clef check and reset their G meter. At an appropriate energy level, 180 to 200 knots indicated, and approximately in the middle of the altitude block, number 1 directs the ET with a radio call. Following the comm entry drill, number 1 makes a moderate G turn away from number 2 at max power. Number 2 maneuvers into the fighting wing cone by pulling up and rolling towards lead. When in the fighting wing cone, 2 calls in. Both aircraft then set and maintain the briefed power setting throughout the exercise. Flying ET, each pilot is responsible for taking the necessary action to avoid a collision. However, it is 2's primary responsibility not to hit 1. Because of the dynamic nature of ET, the potential for collision is increased, and flying ET requires uncompromising flight discipline. Any pilot in either aircraft must call terminate or knock it off if appropriate. During ET, number 1 is a training platform for number 2. Continually monitor G loading and remember that number 2 typically requires more G than 1 to maintain position. Generally, look for number 2 behind the wing in the 4 to 5 o'clock or 7 to 8 o'clock position, and be more vigilant if 2 strays from the cone parameters. If necessary, terminate or transition to the next lower level of ET until 2 can maintain the fighting wing cone. Monitor number 2's aspect, range, closure, heading crossing angle, and line of sight for the possibility of an inadvertent 3-9 line or bubble violation. Do not delay calling knock it off if it is evident one of these situations is about to occur. It is far more desirable to knock it off prior to the excursion than to see the situation developing and wait for it to happen. Tight, high G maneuvers are of little value if number 2 is unable to maintain proper position. Never maneuver in an unpredictable or abrupt manner that may force 2 inside the bubble or forward of the 3-9 line. Generally, number 2 uses varying degrees of lead pursuit to maintain the fighting wing cone during ET. Closure, range, aspect, heading crossing angle, and line of sight rate changes can occur rapidly, so be prepared to maneuver accordingly. Pause momentarily to see how rapidly number 1 is moving in the canopy. Predict number 1's flight path, and then maneuver by selecting the appropriate pursuit option and proper lift vector placement. Use pure and leg pursuit judiciously to avoid high aspect, heading crossing angles, and line of sight rates. Normally, little time is spent in leg pursuit. Part 2 of this formation series discussed pursuit in the vertical and horizontal axes. Vertical pursuit, accomplished by 2 pulling more or less G than 1, can be beneficial in ET if used properly. From number 2's perspective, vertical lead pursuit is recognized when they are seeing the top of number 1's wing. If 2 is using vertical leg pursuit, they will see the blue underside of number 1's wing. Pure vertical pursuit is recognized by seeing skinny wing, meaning 2 is coplane with 1. When the desired learning objectives are met, number 1 may direct a transition to another level of maneuvering or terminate. If number 2 wants number 1 to discontinue maneuvering, notify 1 with a terminate call and state the reason. Number 1 then directs the formation as required and may subsequently resume maneuvering or initiate a reform or rejoin. To end the exercise, number 1 or number 2 calls terminate. Number 1 may reduce power when 2 is in sight and when 2 acknowledges the terminate call. 2 will then maintain the fighting wing position until 1 directs a reform or another formation position. After each ET exercise, number 1 directs an ops check and states their fuel and Gs. Number 2 responds with their fuel and Gs. About halfway through the sortie, number 1 and number 2 exchange formation positions. This is known as a lead or position change. Lead changes can be made with the formation in many flight attitudes. Number 1 will call or signal for the lead change. If in fingertip, number 2 will move out to root, then assume a root position near line abreast and approximately 2 ship width spacing. If the formation is already in root or greater spacing, number 1 may use the radio to transfer the lead. Number 2 accepts the lead after reaching a position of beam number 1 and immediately assumes the responsibility of the new number 1. The old number 1 will assume wingman responsibilities. Number 2 accepts the lead after reaching a position of beam number 1. If the position change is used with 2 ship width spacing, 2 will do a large head nod as they are passing the old lead's 3-9 line. Old 2 immediately assumes responsibility as the new number 1. The old number 1 will assume wingman responsibilities. The new number 1 turns on the TAS and switches the transponder to out after assuming the number 1 position. The new number 2 stabilizes en route and will turn off the TAS and switch the transponder to standby once they receive the traffic TAS call. This is done to ensure the new number 1 remembers to take the TAS and transponder. Unless changed by the new number 1, the formation will remain in the position from which the lead change was initiated. For example, if the lead change was initiated from root, the flight will remain en route. Wingman consideration dictates that after completing the lead change, the new number 1 utilizes a power setting that allows the new number 2 to stabilize in the assigned position. During a battle damage check, aircraft within a formation maneuver to inspect each other for damage, leaks, missing panels, or irregularities. BD checks are generally performed after aggressive maneuvering such as extended trail, tactical formation, or combat ops. Number 1 initiates the BD check using a radio call or the checkmark visual signal. If in fingertip, 2 automatically moves to the root position, approximately 2 ship width spacing, and climbs to see the opposite wingtip of number 1's aircraft, descends back to root position and performs a crossunder to look at the other side in the same fashion. Number 2 must maintain nose-tail separation while inspecting number 1. Upon completion of the check, 2 will return to root on the opposite side of 1 from which the check was initiated. If there are no discrepancies on number 1's aircraft, 2 passes a thumbs up signal to number 1 indicating a clean BD check. If 1 is not clean, 2 will use the radio to describe any discrepancies. Number 1 then initiates a lead change and 2 assumes navigational lead while clearing for the flight. Nav lead means number 1 aircraft maintains control of the radios, squawk, and TAS while inspecting. Nav lead position must clear for the formation, comply with all clearances, and maneuver away from any MO borders if applicable. Following the normal lead change procedures just described, number 1 inspects 2 in the same manner that 2 did, passes a thumbs up, and is given the lead position back. Formation instrument procedures are the same as for a single ship. Number 1 directs configuration with a radio call or a visual signal. Use a radio call in IMC. The gear and flaps are normally lowered with only one signal unless briefed otherwise. Formation approaches are flown with takeoff flaps. After internal confirmation, 2 checks number 1's configuration and gives a thumbs up signal. Number 1 checks 2 and returns a thumbs up if the configuration looks good. Number 1 transmits a gear down call for both aircraft after configuration confirmation. Maintain 110 knots indicated minimum. 120 knots is recommended on the instrument approach unless winds dictate otherwise. Formation approaches either end in a drag maneuver, a go-around, or a missed approach. Drag procedures are described in the Advanced T6 Operating Procedures and Standards document. For a formation go-around, number 1 smoothly adds power to approximately 75% torque, follows normal formation takeoff and single ship go-around procedures. If a formation missed approach is required, the potential for lost wingman and spatial disorientation is high. Smoothly advance power to approximately 75%, as in the formation go-around, and slowly and smoothly establish the missed approach pitch attitude. Use the radio to direct gear and flap retraction. Ensure the minimum climb gradient is maintained. Radio calls to 2 stating current aircraft attitude can help avoid spatial disorientation. This concludes the T6 basic formation lesson. This presentation is not meant to replace self-study of the Squadron Operating Standards or the 11248. Even after watching this video series, you'll still no doubt need to have conversations with an instructor to clear up any confusion you may have or discuss the finer points of certain formation maneuvers, such as extended trail. Hopefully this video series helps you in your learning of the art of formation flight. Good luck and don't hit lead.